Hey, everybody. We're back. It's Lectures on Lacan. You may have found us through Instagram, Substack, whatever. Aren't I supposed to say that at the start of these things? Isn't that where I'm supposed to do is like plug our socials? I just love being here. I love talking about this stuff with y'all. I love talking with my students about this too, but this is really fun. This is a really fun thing. It's one of the greatest things for me that came of the pandemic. And I know it's weird to talk about great things coming of the pandemic, but being able to link up with you all across so many time zones is really where it's at. I think it's just a tremendous benefit of all of this turn to Zoom. It's also tragic that time and touch can't be mediated. And in an age when it's so easy to connect with others via Zoom, email, Instagram Live, whatever, I would like to say that it makes touch and time spent together more important, not less. The easier it gets to connect virtually from afar, the more meaningful it is when you can be there in person. I long for that. I think that would be great. A lot of folks on this call, given our starting 10 a.m. slot, are in from Europe. I'll be there in November. Series of talks in Rome. Looks like 4 are shaping up right now. I don't know if there are any Italians on the call, any Romans on the call, but you're welcome to join. And I'm going to try and get the hosts of those events in Rome in November to have them live streamed, perhaps on YouTube, see if Instagram might host that. But definitely they'll be recorded, maybe chopped up and put into the podcast, which, by the way, as we're getting started here, a lot of you are checking out this podcast. The podcast is a riot. I love this. This is fabulous. I love podcasts. I think this is great. Who knows? Maybe it's the future of Lectures on Lacan, but a major breakthrough, big news coming up about the podcast, a collaboration with an artist that is really my hero. And this guy is just putting out the best stuff that I've seen in a while. And yeah, he and I are going to be doing something pretty soon. Maybe something at the front and back end of every episode. More on that soon. For now, we've got the drive. So let's get right to it. The drive. At the level of the drive, there are openings galore. And that's the important thing to remember about the drive. The first headline that we have here is this: the cause of desire is the object of the drive. The cause of desire is the experience of lack. We'll talk about that today. Now, it's all over previous lectures. If you want this in spades, check out our series on anxiety and our series on Seminar 11. So I'm not going to rehearse all that stuff because it's out there, it's available to you. But I do want to emphasize this. Object little a is a symbol for the experience of lack. The little hole in the middle of the A to indicate where things ain't. That little a marks the object cause of desire. It tells us that there's an experience of lack that gets the wheel of desire rolling towards objects that we hope stuff into that lack. Desire moves quickly away from its cause. It doesn't want to deal with lack. And yet that is precisely what desire always winds up with. You might even say the telos of desire is more desire. And by extension, a kind of blinded relationship to the lack that causes it. Desire, though, moves in a different direction from drive. Drive starts with all the stuff that we think we want, all the imaginary fixations in the world of stuff, objects, things, consumer entities, quids and quodes and widgets, and moves from them quickly back to the cause of desire, symbolized again by object little a. That's why I say the cause of desire is the object of the drive. And these two things are moving in different directions. Desire proceeds via sublimation as far as the drive is concerned. We'll talk about that. The drive, as I said last time, proceeds via desublimation. It proceeds from the stuff, these objects that have been elevated to the dignity of the thing. which is an unfortunate takeaway from Seminar 7. Not that Lacan doesn't mean what he's saying there when he says that sublimation shows that ordinary objects are elevated to the level of the thing, dignified even with the level of the thing. What's important to note, though, is the indignity that das Ding suffers when ordinary objects are brought to bear. What the drive does is it reverses that process. It desublimates, moving from imaginary objects, stuff that desire is constantly chasing, the object of desire, back to the cause of desire, not objects, but openings. And that's important here, because the opening that conditions desire is an opening caused by the prohibition of an object, typically a body part, connected to another opening, one of many mouths on the human body. Prohibit the breast in weaning, makes the mouth not just an erogenous zone because it's full of nerve endings, but one that's supercharged with logics of prohibition. And these openings, the erogenous zones, sources of the drive, are portals to what we really lack, which is libido. So you can see how the drive in reversing the course of desire is going to march us from imaginary objects to objects little a, back to partial objects, from there to the erogenous zones to which these objects remain attached at some level, and through those erogenous zones, which are archaic residues of libido, by the way, back into this pure, undivided sense of life, a body that is pre-organized, not disorganized. This may be the body without organs. That question is still open for us. My point at this level is just to emphasize the amount of openings and portals that the drive accesses. It does not work at the level of the object, it works at the level of the opening. Erogenous zones, sources of the drive, these are openings. Object causes, object little a, this is an opening. It's not an object. It's a lack, a space, an opening. You might even say the circuit of the drive, the circuit itself that comes up, loops around like a child blowing bubbles with gum and returns back to its source. Even the circuit of the drive, that it runs around the opening that is little a, forms itself a kind of open structure, a vascular structure. That's partly why we ended our last lecture on the drive talking about Makido, blowing bubbles. Think about the musculature and the way we use the fence of the teeth and the tongue and the lips, and crucially, air. Inhaled, exhaled into the bubble, brought back in. That pulsative, rhythmic, in, out, through openings, most of which can be closed also, is crucial, not just to the drive. It's also crucial to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is a science. We talked about this last time as well. But it is not a science that is concerned with objectivity, with objects in the world. It's not concerned with stuff. It's concerned with the cause for stuff. It's concerned not with objects, but with openings. Its target is not objectivity. Its stake is not objectivity, but instead what I called objectality, which is not the study of objects in the world, but instead of a certain dimension of the world that makes objects possible. Objectality studies the condition of possibility for stuff that modern science can then focus on and study. So the object of inquiry in psychoanalysis is also an opening at the level of the cause. And that's the science of psychoanalysis. It's a science of cause. That's why we talk about objet as the object cause of desire. We're concerned with causes, less so with effects. Although many of the key concepts in psychoanalysis are effects, the real jouissance, as we often conceive of it, these are effect structures of castration and the symbolic, but it's at the level of the cause that Lacan sees psychoanalysis developing. I want to add one more thing that's going to put us on the path and show us one more way that openings figure largely here, not just at the level of the drive, our specific topic, not just at the broad level of inquiry of psychoanalysis, but specifically at the level of the object, the primary object, the starting original object of psychoanalysis, the discovery that Freud makes in his early 40s, the unconscious. The unconscious is indeed structured like a language, blah, blah, blah. Not that that's an irrelevant point, but just we've heard enough about that. The unconscious, though, has a temporal pulsative structure. It has an edge-like structure, a rim-like structure. This is what Lacan is starting to realize in the 60s as he turns away from the symbolic, away from language, and into the real, is that the way the unconscious works is sometimes it's hard as rock, other times it's the pulsative walls of a cave, certain type of cave in particular, as we're going to see. If you've got ears to hear, of course, I'm starting to put us on the path of position of the unconscious, this essay that I invited everybody to read before today's session. The unconscious is also wrapped up in moments of opening and closing. We're going to focus on that today as well. It may even be one of the primary stakes we get at here. The drive, psychoanalysis, and the unconscious itself, they're all wrapped up in logics of opening. Openings that can be closed, openings that have rim-like structures, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get to it. So let's start with this essay, Position of the Unconscious. Now, those of you with French, you know that position in French means a lot like position in English. It's a location, it can mean a place and the like, but it can also mean a stance. It can mean a posture, a pose. Position can also mean an attitude, to take a position towards something. And I want to offer this, shout out to my man Kenneth Burke here. Attitudes are incipient acts. To persuade somebody is not to force them to do something. That's not persuasion, that's compulsion. Compulsion occurs by the barrel of a gun. You will march or you will die. Persuasion is by coaxing, by luring, drawing. It does not operate at the level of the act. You don't persuade someone by forcing them to do something. You persuade someone by causing their attitude toward a certain entity or act to shift. Rhetorical theory from antiquity forward has been about the art of attitude adjustment. You don't change how people act, you change how they think. Because an attitude is an incipient act. Once you've changed someone's mind, you're now primed to change their act. Which is why, as you know, knowledge is only half the battle here. You can lead, or I'll skip the metaphors here, from G.I. Joe to horses led to water. Let's just cut to the chase. It's one thing to have the big breakthrough in analytic experience when you realize, oh shit, that's the thing I keep doing over and over again. Oh, that might be where that comes from. But that big insight doesn't immediately translate into changed living, better conduct, right living, non-symptomatic living. It doesn't work that way. The same level and degree and number of habits that went into producing the clinical structure have to be done differently in order to unwind it. So it's not like once you change someone's mind and bring them to the insight that they're immediately willing to go in a certain direction. It takes time. It takes time, but attitudes are incipient acts. And I'm emphasizing this because the question of the position of the unconscious is not just a question of where the unconscious is. It's a question of an implicit how the unconscious operates. It's not just a where, but there's also a how involved in Lacan's choice of this word position of the unconscious. What I'm trying to get at here is that the unconscious does have a spatial, geometric, topological position, but it also is dynamic, operative, and has a temporal structure as well. It's not just spatial. That's why all this emphasis in psychoanalysis on the where can be misleading. Where it was, so on and so forth. The spatiality of the unconscious, this other place, is completely important. It's very relevant. Crucially missed, though, often in those conversations is the way that the unconscious is a temporal structure. It moves also according to time. In fact, the movement of the unconscious, when it pops up and when it goes away, is by way of temporal pulsation. These are pulses in time, openings in time, at the level of symptomatic expression, slip and the like, that allow for the unconscious to find expression. And then also the transference, which would be the opposite, which would be a closure. Transference is important because it shows you where there is an opening for the unconscious, although that opening is presently closed. So you see at the level of the unconscious a structure that's not just linguistic, but also edge-like. That's going to be important as well to remember. So even readings of unconscious at the level of structure can oftentimes go astray. It's not just that the unconscious is structured like a language, it's that it also has an edge-like structure that's going to become important in this essay, position of the unconscious. But it also has a key operation. There's an operationality of the unconscious, and its move is by temporal pulsation. You have openings that are oftentimes caused by trauma. The primal scene is an incision or a cut that produces an opening through which further down the road, symptomatic expressions can pop up. It's the causeway for symptoms, but it also has closings. The trauma is also what allows for repression, a closing of sorts. And further down the road, transference, which, as you heard me just say, is also a closing of sorts. If you've read Seminar 11, you know I'm not straying far from this text. This is Lacan breaking down basically how the structure of repression and return of the repressed works. You're cruising along, you have a traumatic experience, a signifier of that experience is repressed. It goes into this newly founded place called the unconscious, where it then mixes up with other signifiers. And then later on in a different scenario, circumstance, you have a return of the repressed because that signifier now connects to another signifier in your environment, and pow. The trauma and that symptomatic pow are openings, temporal pulsations, pulsations in the lived experience of the individual, moments of seizure or rupture, openings in time, openings for something other than just the elapse of time, something more retrospective, more insightful. Psychoanalytic anamnesis is what I'm talking about here. The resubjectivization of one's past to transform it into one's history. Again, we've covered this in other lectures, so I'm not going to get too far into it. What's new for us, y'all, starts on page 710 of EURIAS. Now listen, many of you don't have the book. That's cool. The book is linked on the same page where you found the link for this Zoom call. So if you go back to that page in our Substack, you'll see under these readings, there's a little access it here. You can click on that, then you've got a PDF of the standard English translation of EURIAS. Worth having in front of you because we're going to be looking at probably 5 or 6 pages closely read from position of the unconscious, all to put us right on top of the drive. Check out how this works. Page 710 in the standard English translation. It's deep. You hear that? You hear all the page turning? It's important to note. It's worth noting. This is how far in the book we get by the time position of the unconscious pops up. The goods begin at the bottom of the page, on page 710. Immediately, notice what's happening, the symposium. And check it out. Freud is a guest one can risk inviting impromptu to the symposium. The symposium is like the backstory that's happening here. And I think it's one of the least explored aspects of the drive. You heard me say it last time. Those of you in the Seminar 11 series also heard me end on this point. This is exactly where Seminar 11 ends, of course, on the topic of love. The symposium is about love. It is also the fundamental text that Lacan takes up in Seminar 8, which is not called love, by the way. You know what it's called. Seminar 8 is also where we get introduced to other characters, not just Aristophanes, but also, crucially, Alcibiades. That is the background of what's happening with the drive. Because the primary stake of the drive isn't just connecting to your libido, reclaiming and restoring some aspect of that in the midst of death, in the field of castration. It's not just that. In so doing, you prepare yourself for love. Not just love of self, but being able to love another person. And love for Lacan, despite whatever you're going to hear, means giving what you don't have. And that's crucial. The drive enables you to give what you don't have to someone else, than to accept them in a way that can only be described as love. It's no coincidence from the symposium to Seminar 8 to the drive, this background theme of love is there. Hopefully we'll get there. I think it's the furthest reaches. If drive is the beyond of analysis, love is the beyond of the drive. So, bottom of 710. Here comes position of the unconscious, the topic, the symposium, clear-sightedness concerning love. Transference is there too. There's the title of Seminar 8. Now, last two lines on page 710. I hope that interlude on love gave you a chance to put the text in front of you, because you're going to want to see this stuff. It's weird. Here we go. My seminar was not where it speaks. Remember what you just heard me say about the position of the unconscious. As people happened to say jokingly, it brought forth the place from which it could speak, opening more than one ear to hear things that would have been passed over indifferently, since they would not have been recognized. One of my auditors put it naively, announcing the marvelous fact that that very evening, or perhaps just the day before, he had come across in a session with a patient that I had said in my seminar verbatim. Now we get to it. Remember, this is about the unconscious. He's not yet talking about the drive. The place in question is the entrance to the cave. Now, you can hear this in terms of Plato and the Republic and the famous riff in there that seems to be the only one everybody wants to talk about, the allegory of the cave. Here, though, we're talking about the cave of the unconscious. The place in question is the entrance to the cave, toward the exit of which Plato guides us. Now, if you know the allegory of the cave, you've got this story. Do I need to go through? I don't know. Well, here we go. Plato's got this story, the allegory of the cave, and it's designed to show you the difference between public opinion, doxa, and truth. And here he doesn't, I don't think he means aletheia in the Heideggerian recuperative sense of the pre-Socratic truth that shows itself, that breaks forth from closure as disclosure, from concealment as unconcealment. I don't think that's quite what Plato's talking about here. He's doing something different. But here we have this image of the cave. In this cave, people are lashed to poles with fires burning behind them. And all they see is the cave wall in front of them. The fires burn behind, casting light and throwing shadows on the wall. And this, Plato says, is how most people spend their lives, is just watching shadows move across the wall. In other words, not looking at the real thing. The question is, what happens when somebody wriggles loose? They get out. Here's the philosopher, climbing out of the cave into the bright daylight of actual things. You might even read this as the origin of heaven and hell in the early Christian tradition. Don't forget, the medievals were so convinced that Plato was a Christian, that Platonic thought comported so well with Christianity, that they just went ahead and called it. Yeah, he was Christian, regardless of the fact that we're talking, this was hundreds of years before anything even like Jesus. And there were many likes Jesus out there had popped up. Plato could be reconciled so thoroughly with Christianity in the medieval period, not just because they had a wackadoo mindset without a chronological sense of time, allowing them to have somebody 300 years ago become somebody, a follower of someone not born until, well, year zero, which is also an invention, by the way, of the Dark Age period, I believe. In about the 800s, somebody came up and said, you know what, why don't we just start the clock over with Jesus at zero? Prior to that time, man, it was crazy. Calendars all over the place. The year in Rome right now is very different from the year here in San Francisco, and I'm grateful for that. The cave in question, though, that would allow the philosopher out is not one that the philosopher would dare ever return to, because you know what happens. The truth teller that sees the broad daylight and then returns to the cave to tell everybody about it doesn't get celebrated. The motherfucker gets torn apart, locked up in the nut jar, never to be released again. And here you have something different. The analyst is not on the inside trying to get out, but on the outside trying to get in. Pay attention to this. The place in question is the entrance to the cave, toward the exit of which Plato guides us, while one imagines seeing the psychoanalyst entering there. But things are not that easy, as it is an entrance one can only reach just as it closes. Read Transference. It's when the opening closes that we can see where the opening is. Needless to say, Lacan adds here, this place will never be popular with tourists. And the only way for it to open up a bit is by calling from the inside. So the analyst is on the outside, notices an opening that is now closed, and there's something calling from the inside. I would wager that this is the unconscious that calls forth from behind a closed cave door to an analyst waiting to get in. This is not unsolvable, assuming the open sesame of the unconscious consists in having speech effects, since it is linguistic in structure, but requires that the analyst re-examine the way in which it closes. Openings, closings, openings, closings. How does it close? Not just where is the cave, but how does it close? Position doesn't just mean where. There is an incipient how in that where. Not just where the closure is, but we have to re-examine the way that the opening closes. And we're Lacan to continue here. Also the way the closures are opened. We have to account for, what we have to account for is a gap, beat, or alternating section to follow some of Freud's indications. And that is what I have proceeded to do in grounding the unconscious in a topology. Now, this is important here. We're at the end of a creed. We're in a different period of Lacan's career. This is early mid-60s thinking. This is a move away from the tropological work that Lacan is doing with the symbolic. So tropes here, the dominant tropes, the Greek from trope, turns of languages, ways of speaking. The two dominant ones for Lacan, of course, are metonymy, which he says names via quintillion, Freud's understanding of displacement in dreams, and metaphor, which again via quintillion, but there were lots of folks talking about topology in antiquity, who links it to condensation, the merging of images in the dream. So Lacan, early and middle Lacan to some extent, is very concerned with topology, language maneuvers, turns and twists. Symptom is very much a twisty, turny linguistic thing. But between the symptom and the synthome, you have a transformation away from the symbolic and toward the real, away from tropology and towards topology, which has to do with topos, places, structures. So you see turns towards the torus. You see turns towards little cute vases. You see turns towards Mobius strips. And eventually it culminates in a series of tied knots. Hence seminar 23 for those of you that took that class with me. Pay attention to this though. The unconscious is grounded in a topology, Lacan tells us. The structure of what closes is indeed inscribed in a geometry in which space is reduced to a combinatory. It is what is called an edge in topology. This is what I mean when I say the unconscious has an edge-like structure. The topology of the unconscious is geometric, a series of edges. And an edge, if you think about it in mathematics, an edge is just the line that connects 2 points of a triangle, for instance. A triangle has 3 edges. A square has 4 edges. That's what we're doing here. But check it out. By formally studying the consequences of the irreducibility of the cut it makes, one could rework some of the most interesting functions between aesthetics and logic. And that's where we leave it. Then he's on to like retroactivity, which is fascinating in its own right, but that's not what we're up to here today. The cut that it makes, radical rereadings of aesthetics and logic. I'll leave you to figure that out. We don't have enough time. Right now, blast forward to page 716. This is where Lacan picks it up again. What we're going to see here as we get into pages 716 to 720, really right up to the end of the essay, is all the good stuff that puts us on the path of the drive. And not just the drive, but sexuality, the myth of sexuality that Lacan adds as supplement in the strong Derridian sense to the dominant Aristophanes myth of 2 hemispheres coming together. Page 716. Who wants to read? Starting from about the middle of the page, in the paragraph that begins, I would say the last, well, what the hell? I'll start because it's kind of a weird way to find this. As usual with Lacan, and really with great writers generally, a paragraph break is at once a harbinger of things to come and a post-figuration of what you just read. A break in a paragraph is not unlike a scansion that might occur in analytic experience. It's a punctuation point, a caesura of sorts, that at once conditions and prefigures what comes next, but also gives a retroactive opportunity to reflect on what's gone before. And this paragraph break here on 716 is one that might be useful to us as well. Up to this point, he's running his usual game about the other and desire and the subject being founded in the locus of the other, which is fabulous. But that's not what we're working on here today. He's talking about the opacity of the being he receives, and this is the being of the unconscious, through his advent as a subject in the locus of the other. So everything that you've heard, let's see, probably in the lectures on subversion of the subject, but then also in some of the introductory stuff in seminar 3, and certainly in some of the early lectures on seminar 11. We rehearse all of this stuff about desire and the subject founded in the locus of the other. It's great, it's tremendous, but again, we're moving past it here. The opacity of the being of the unconscious he receives through his advent as a subject in the locus of the other, such as he was first produced by the other's summoning. I love it. Come here, I want you, Watson. Come here, Watson, Edison says, I want you. Hang up the phone and come here, I want you. Summoned by Thomas Edison. The next paragraph is the one where we want to start. It is an operation. We read the last bit because I want to have that it referred. Who can read starting with it is an operation, starting on page 716 of the Standard English translation of McCree? Hook it up.
It is an operation whose fundamental outlines are found in psychoanalytic technique. For it is insofar as the analyst intervenes by scanding the patient's discourse that an adjustment occurs in the pulsation of the rim through which the being that resides just shy of it must flow.
Okay, right on. Hold on. That's brilliant. Thank you. We're just going to keep doing this, like pause and like add comments and then keep reading and stuff like that. Here you start hearing the talk of the pulsation. The pulsation business is up in the front of seminar 11 if you want to check it out. And by the way, all of this is happening at the same time in Lacan's thought. Position of the unconscious, the Trieb essay, seminar 11, all the things I've asked you to read for this series, the texts that we're working with, are all happening at about the same time, 1960 to about 1965. So it's no coincidence that you're going to see a recurring theme here of pulsation of the rim through which the being that is the unconscious and resides just shy of it must flow. So here you see a shift away from cave-like, stone-like openings to something that must flow through that opening in the moment of pulsation, the pulsation of a rim that opens, closes. This is what I want you to think of whenever you hear Lacan talking about pulsation. Mouth, anus, eye, ear, not so much, but lots of parts of the body open in order to close. The pores, when sweat comes out, and sometimes other things go in. So it's important to emphasize also here the word just shy here. Notice also we're talking about scanding the patient's discourse. There's that caesura, that break, that opening, that propitious punctuation, as Lacan calls it in the 1950s in his first Rome discourse, which, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, position of the unconscious is the second. His first Rome discourse is the function in the field essay, the manifesto of Lacanian psychoanalysis. This position of the unconscious, he says, is the sequel to his Rome discourse. So if you want to know like whether this is an important essay or whether he thought it was, for whatever that's worth, it is. This is the follow-up to that essay. And that essay in the mid-50s is where he introduces the notion of scansion and really puts it forward. It's where you get the button tie business and all that stuff. There's more of it elsewhere, but it's a good place to find it. And so here we are again in the clinic, scanding, but with dominant theories of pulsation of a rim through which the unconscious that resides just shy of it, just shy of that rim, that cave opening is where the unconscious resides. The unconscious is not the cave door that closes or opens. The unconscious resides just shy of that cave door. And it is through that door, in moments of pulsation, where the rim opens and then closes, that the unconscious, like a bubble from a child's mouth, must flow. Okay, thank you for letting me cut in. I'm going to be an asshole and just keep doing it because I think it's important for us to read a paragraph, sit with it, chop it up, and then take a deep breath, read another one. Please, by all means, Anyone can continue reading, or my friend just continue. We're all good.
Okay. The true and final mainspring of what constitutes transference is the expectation of this being's advent in relation to what I call the analyst's desire. Do you want me to pause? Sorry, I
all good.
Anticipated a pause there. Okay. What I call the analyst's desire, insofar as something about the analyst's own position has remained unnoticed therein, at least up until now.
I mean, this is one of those paragraphs where it's very tempting to take that turn. And let's not forget, this is also where the key piece on Drive, Seminar 11, ends. It doesn't just end with limitless love. It ends in the analyst's desire. And if you think about it, I wonder if there's any other desire at stake in the clinic than the analyst's desire. The analyst's desire, who gives a fuck? All right, let's get to it. Let's figure it out. But that's not what's at stake. It's a central part of what happens in analytic experience, but it is not the final horizon. It's not the end of analytic experience. The end of analytic experience is not the understanding of unconscious desire, but the cultivation of something more like the drive. At least that's what I'm reading from Lacan to Miller to Fink. And so part of what we want to do in this session is to really figure out what that would mean and why, again, Seminar 11 ends with the drive and not desire. But what's great here is I think what Lacan's partly suggesting is that the operative desire in analytic experience is in fact the analyst's desire. That's partly what gets things cracking. And I think that Bruce Fink would suggest the same if you read the end of this clinical introduction. It's the enigmatic, unidentifiable properties of the analyst's desire that allow the discussion to be turned back and beyond the analyst's desire. So, like I said, sorry about that. Tempting, very tempting, but we got to crack on here. Can we please continue with This Is Why? I'm going to talk more about this cave.
This is why transference is a relationship that is essentially tied to time and its handling. But what is the being that responds to us, operating in the field of speech and language, from shy of the cave's entrance? I would go so far as to embody it in the form of the very walls of the cave that would like to live, or rather, come alive with palpitations whose living movement must be grasped now. That is, now that I have articulated the function and field of speech and language in their conditioning.
Okay. Wow. So the being in question here is the unconscious. That's what he's working at here, is the being that is the unconscious, that responds to us, perhaps us as analysts, operationalizing in the field of speech and language, even if only at the level of the symptom. But the symptom is a signifier. From shy of the cave's entrance, what is this thing, the unconscious, that's using language to holler at us from behind a closed cave wall? He wants to embody it in the form of the very walls of the cave. So the unconscious is not the cave door, and it's not just lurking shy of the entrance or exit. He wants to embody it in the walls of the cave, provided we allow that this is a cave whose walls are alive with palpitations, alive with living movement. I only know of a couple of caves in the human body that are alive with living movement. If you're imagining this cave as kind of like a tunnel-like structure, perhaps leading up from Plato's realm of shadow. Kind of interesting here. You might read the whole body as a cave. What else is the vascular structure of the lungs but a giant opening? It's tempting to read this, though, as a series of openings and then ask what the cave is. The opening of the mouth leads to the cave of the oral orifice. Maybe. The opening that is the anus leads to the cave of the end of the digestive system, colon, and so forth. But you know what? When I think life and living cave walls, I can't help but think about the birth canal. And I think that's relevant here. I think that what he's actually alluding to here is a vaginal cave. And not in the sense of put penis, etc. in, but in the biological sense of life that comes out through a series of palpitations and pulsations of the very walls of the cave. To be crass, but also to take a risk, which is what this is all about. That's why we do this live, so that it can be risky. None of this is pre-rehearsed, anything like that. I can barely read my damn notes. We're just looking at the book here. I can't help but wonder if the unconscious here is embodied in the cave that is the birth canal, the walls of the birth canal. It's an interesting turn. This last little paragraph before Lacan makes a big shift, I do not see how anyone can rightfully claim that I neglect dynamics in my topology. I orient it, which is better than to make a commonplace of it. The most verbal is not where people are willing to say it is. First part, most important part. Lacan's approach to topology is not just spatial. It is temporal as well. It is not just fixed, posed. It is also dynamic. That's important here. All of Lacan's topologies, although concerned with positions of various sorts, have movement, life, palpitations built into them. And the unconscious is no exception. Lacan doesn't just think organically. The topic of Lacanian psychoanalysis is a kind of organicity. It has to do with living, moving shapes, bubbles, if you will. This is what Peter Sloterdijk took from Lacan. We're going to get to that too. You might also think, if you've read a bunch of Lacan and you think about this stuff, think how often he returns to animals. This guy would love Animal Planet. This guy would absolutely have that channel going all the time, probably during analysis too. He'd get a haircut and watch Animal Planet while the analyzand talks. Now we get to the shift though. And it's this shift that puts us on the path of the drive very narrowly. And let me tell you, we can easily slide off it for better and for worse. Who wants to read starting with "as for sexuality"? He straightened us out on topology. It's dynamic, baby. It's not just what and where, but how. As for sexuality, Lacan's basically answering for some stuff here. Who wants to take it, starting with "as for sexuality"?
As for sexuality, which people would like to remind me is the force we deal with, and that it is biological, I retort that analysts perhaps have not shed as much light as people at one time hoped on sexuality's mainsprings, recommending only that we be natural, repeatedly trotting out the same themes of billing and cooing. I will try to contribute something newer that's an interesting one, newer, by resorting to a genre that Freud himself never claimed to have superseded in this area, myth.
Okay, put it on your radar. When Lacan talks about the drive, he's thinking mythically. And I think Kopchak has this down as well. I think that it's pretty clear that when Lacan talks about the drive, noticeably the libido, he's putting forth a myth. Freud's got his myths. This is Lacan's myth. This is the myth. Aristophanes had his myth. Plato sure as hell had some myths. Reincarnation, what are we talking about? Here is Lacan's myth. And it is a myth that gives him his theory of sexuality. So you've heard a lot about men and women and there being no such thing as a sexual rapport. It doesn't exist. Of course it doesn't exist. I don't know why we keep talking about it. Nevertheless, I think one direction to go from here would be to a reading of Seminar 19 and Seminar 20. That could be a good way to turn out of the drive into 19 and 20, given the theme of sexuality that Lacan's introducing here. But notice this. Prior to that discussion, Lacan is approaching sexuality at the level of a myth. It's mythical for him in its connection to death and the libido. And it's here. It's also in 11, but it's here in the early to mid 60s that he starts cracking this out. Myth is the operative word as we shift into the topic of sexuality. Dynamic is the operative word in topology. Myth is the operative word in sexuality. So Lacan wants to be clear. I'm going to throw some mythical shit your way and see what it is. The amoeba business, the lamella business, that's all a myth that Lacan is just putting together. We can talk about why he needs a myth here. But first, let's see if we can figure out what the myth is. Please continue reading with to compete with Aristophanes.
To compete with Aristophanes on his own turf in the above-mentioned Symposium, let us recall his primitive, double-backed creatures, in which two halves are fused together as firmly as those of a Magdeburg sphere.
Yeah.
Halves, separated later by a surgical operation arising from Zeus's jealousy, represent the beings we have become in love. We have become in love, starving for our unfindable complement.
Oh, damn. Starving for our unfindable complement. Do you all know what a Magdeburg sphere is?
No.
It's weird. Go ahead.
Oh, I said no.
Oh, seriously. Yeah, let's get to it. I love it that the hole in knowledge that is ignorance, and that's really what ignorance is. It's a hole in knowledge. I love it, though, that oftentimes that hole is marked with the word no. It's brilliant. But that's not what Magdeburg sphere is about. My understanding is that it was some weird ass experiment where to demonstrate atmospheric pressure, there was some way that some dude, because it was always these damn dudes, putting together two halves of a sphere and creating a suction between the two that like just couldn't be pulled apart. And what he was trying to demonstrate there, I think very fascinatingly here, is atmospheric pressure. The Magdeburg sphere, when the two hemispheres are brought together and inseparable, demonstrates something about pressure. And as we know, this is fundamentally what gets the drive moving, which is a thrust, a pressure that is constant. I don't know if there's much there to go on, but it did strike me as this image popping up in the beginning of his summary of Aristophanes' myth. Okay, let's get to the good stuff, because now we get into Lacan's myth. That was Aristophanes, culminating in demonstrations of atmospheric pressure. Now notice, if Aristophanes' myth in the classical era, myth of love, of starving for our unfindable complement, culminates in the modern scientific development of atmospheric pressure, here's the question. What type of pressure does Lacan's myth culminate in? Yeah, we know. Okay. Let's see how close we can get to the drive with this one. Who wants to read? And please continue if you like. In considering the sphericity of primordial man.
All right, I'll go again. In considering the sphericity of primordial man as much as his division, it is the egg that comes to mind, and that has thus perhaps been repressed since Plato, given the preeminence granted for centuries to the sphere and a hierarchy of forms sanctioned by the natural sciences.
Okay. I want to be clear. I think that the logic of the egg is crucial to what Lacan is doing here. And the history of life on Earth, it can be summarized in an egg. So everything comes from the sea. Okay. One of the first things that come from the sea and enter onto land and hang out there were amphibians. And what you know about amphibians' eggs, right, is that they have to remain near water. So tadpoles emerge from eggs that frogs lay in and around ponds and so forth. Amphibious eggs are gelatinous on the outside. They require the constant moisture. As you move away from amphibians into reptiles and dinosaurs, you start getting eggs that are leatherier and increasingly hardier, self-contained, that no longer need the feed and the moisture of the water, but can now survive in more inhospitable climates. Read climates away from water. As life emerges from water, the egg changes. Creatures who could lay eggs that could withstand drier climates prospered in inland environments. So the egg goes from gelatinous water on the outside to leathery, think turtles, crocodiles, alligators, laying these kind of leathery, pliable eggs, but always buried near water, not in water, but near water in moist environments. And then you get the lizard egg. And then you get, various types of reptile eggs. The development of mammals, warm-blooded animals, warm-blooded life, takes the egg to the next level. What mammals were able to do that reptiles still cannot is to keep the egg inside. The womb is an egg that has been internalized. And that egg can be in water, in desert, outer space, the bottom of the sea. That egg can go everywhere that its host can go. The great development of the mammalian species and all that they contain was the allowance of an egg structure inside the human form. And this is still true today. Lacan's myth is a myth about the mammiferous origin of an interior egg. Perhaps repressed, lost in the natural sciences, but it's how the human egg, the warm-blooded mammal egg, works when giving birth to life, to new individuals, that Lacan is going to find incredibly important here. If you have been looking for the origin story of Lacanian psychoanalysis, students often come to me like, what was there before the symbolic? What was there before castration? Prior to the 60s, all you really had in Lacan in terms of talking about prior pre-linguistic states, the key move comes again in his first Rome discourse. The here and now of the all in the process of becoming. It was just a big jumble, if we could even say that. There was not a world of things. There was not stuff in the world before language, before you were introduced to language. It was just a here and now of the all in a process of becoming, he says in the Function and Field essay. That was really all we had. Now we're getting an answer to it. And let's be clear. What we are getting here is a myth. In other words, I do not want anybody to take this and say, and that's the real. No, the real is an effect structure of the symbolic. Conceptually, logically, experientially, to the extent that we can ever experience the impossible. Like trying to imagine a world without color. Tell me what a tree looks like. Tell me what a colorless tree looks like. That's an effect of symbolic intervention. The real wasn't there before. You might have an X factor of lived experience or something. That's what Lacan's working at here, is this odd X factor to which he assigns a myth. Okay, eggs, myths, let's keep going. Consider the egg. Who wants this one? You know, if you ask a question to a class, I've done this with like small groups, up to hundreds of people in a lecture hall. You can wait about 3 seconds after asking a question. And if nobody replies, after 3 seconds, weird shit starts to happen. Everybody starts getting uncomfortable. And eventually some fool will say something fucking super weird just to make the silence end. Try it. Next time you have an opportunity to ask a small or large group a question, don't rush in as I just did. Instead, just sit back and wait. You can ask and answer the question of why I rushed in to tell you this and ending the silence. But definitely it's worth a try. Western humans struggle with pauses and long moments of silence for a reason.
Isn't that just a product of an obsessional neurotic?
It could be. It very well could be. Yeah, obsessives love to move. They're always at it and after it. And canceling motherfuckers out as they go. They want all the part and none of the whole, which is unfortunate because they miss out on a lot of fun stuff that happens with wholes. Okay, consider the egg in a viviparous womb. I'll let you look that one up, where it has no need for a shell. Hear me now. And recall that whenever the membranes burst, a part of the egg is harmed. For the membranes of the fertilized egg are offspring, just as much as the living being brought into the world by their perforation. Now, I have only been intimately involved in one birth, and I'm going to call it maybe more like an extimate involvement, because I was just kind of there. I was present and pulling things out and doing what I could. I wasn't actually involved in the birth part. But let me tell you, there are 2 births that happen in a vaginal birth. I've never been present for a C-section. I wish somebody, one of my doctor friends, would invite me. I'd love to just hang out and see some of this stuff. But the one birth that I was authorized to attend had 2 birthings. First came the kiddo, and then came the placenta, the membrane, the rest of the egg. That's important here. There are 2 things that are born in the moment of birth. That's what Lacan's getting at here. The membranes of the fertilized egg that have been burst, and then the offspring that are brought into the world by the perforation of those membranes. So if you want to ask yourself, where's the original cut? The original perforation. Consequently, upon cutting the cord, what the newborn loses is not, as analysts think, its mother, but rather its anatomical complement. Midwives call it afterbirth. The anatomical complement is the placenta. That is what the child loses. The newborn does not lose mommy when the second cut of the umbilical cord occurs. What they lose is the anatomical complement that they've known up to that point as the placenta. Now, let's be clear. The placenta is what helps the unborn child breathe. It pumps nutrients and oxygen from the mother's bloodstream to the kid, and also takes the kid's waste and pulls that back out, puts it into the mother's body so that it can be evacuated. I remember asking one of my friends, I think I may have mentioned this. I swear she's delivered like half of Norway at this point. And you know, she's an old timer, but legit. I asked her, I said, what still surprises you as a midwife? as you're delivering these babies, you see people at the grocery store like, oh, you delivered everybody in my family. And there's like 30 people. What still blows your mind? And she said the fact that a child, newborn, can emerge from the birth canal and take a breath. And after that, cry. But that breath for her is just mind-blowing every single time, because prior to that point, the unborn fetus has a lungs full of goop. And yet, even so, what science now shows is that they still yawn. Unborn fetuses yawn, but their lungs are full of goop. Something about the palpitous, pulsing walls of the birth canal, in addition to chemicals released, my understanding from the newborn, actually forces all that gunk out. Part of what happens when a vaginal birth occurs is the pulsings that move the infant out, the same way that pulsings and palpitations bring an egg or a rodent into a snake. You've seen the image. Or in my book, around here, what I see are pocket gophers, these little things about like this, being gobbled up by gray herons. And you can see the gopher wriggling as it goes down the throat, the long neck of the heron. It's a wild phenomenon. Sit in the park, hang out, watch that all day. It's great. Here it's the opposite. The palpitations of a canal that squeezes something out, but in the process, what it also squeezes out is the gunk that was in the lung cavity, allowing for that vascular orifice, that opening, that cave to expand once the birth canal has released it. So the child is in the womb, it's hanging out, it's in its egg, and its lungs are open and full of gunk. It gets squeezed into the birth canal, and that squeezing process, in addition to the chemicals released by the unborn child's body, forces the gunk out and constricting the child. And then the child emerges and they open up again. Their vascular cavity, known as the lungs, now opens up, but instead of having gunk inside, that opening allows for an inspiration of air, a breathing in of air. You see what we're at here? Bubbles. But really what we're talking about is eggs, according to Lacan. So don't go too far down the bubble thing yet. Now, imagine in this moment, every time this happens, when a membrane bursts, a phantom, an infinitely more primal form of life, in no wise willing to settle for a duplicate role in some microcosmic world within a world, takes flight through the same passage. Man, check out the French, is made by breaking an egg, but so is the manlet. Again, check out the French. You gotta crack a few eggs to make an omelet, right? We are made by breaking the eggs, but so is something else. What is this manlet? This image just gets so good as Lacan unfolds it. Here's the myth. The phantom slips out with us. We don't know what that is quite yet. We can guess. Let us assume this phantom to be a large crepe that moves like an amoeba, so utterly flat that it can slip under doors, omniscient as it is guided by the pure life instinct, and immortal as it is fissiparous. Compare fissiparous there to viviparous, up a couple paragraphs earlier. You might have something on the line there. It is certainly something that would not be good to feel dripping down your face noiselessly while you sleep in order to seal it. The image we get in 11 is of this amoeba, like Ridley Scott's Alien, jumping up on your face, and you got to like battle it out with this motherfucker. Here, though, it's more about the egg that I now have on mine. It's more about having egg on your face. Interesting move. What we're getting at here is this lamella, this flat, everywhere at once, amoeba-like creature that we were talking about last time, and it's right there in Lacan's discussion of the drive. in seminar 11. This is libido. This is his myth that puts us on the track of libido. If we are willing to allow the digestive process to begin at this point, we realize that the manlet has ample sustenance for a long time to come. Remember that there are organisms which are quite differentiated that have no digestive tract. There's a lot of life in that libido. And a lot of it doesn't depend on you at all. You know, my temptation in these moments is always just to keep blasting forward. Let me give you a taste of what's at stake here. The placenta is the origin of the respiratory drive. Respiratory erogeneity has received very little attention. Lacan mentions it even as something that needs to be attended to in his essay on the subversion of the subject. I mentioned it last time too. The placenta is how the infant so-called breathes, or the fetus breathes before it's born. It's also what is sundered from the infant. Lacan makes a lot of this in the early 60s. The mama, M-A-M-M-A, is the placenta. He talks about the placenta a lot, I believe in seminar 10 and maybe a little in seminar 9, but seminar 10 I think has a lot of it in there. The placenta is the origin of the respiratory drive. It's also the first opportunity structure for a cry. You see, when the baby pops out, if that thing doesn't cry, the old image of the doctor holding a baby up and swatting it on its ass to get it to cry, it's interesting that there would be a shudder of pain that would drive the infant to cry to get the last of the goop out. Put that in your Lacanian pot, cook it down for a couple hours. But what's interesting here is that once the goop has been cleared out and the first breath is brought in, the next thing to come out is the cry. So here it is. Here's the full sequence. You ready? You're in the womb. Your lungs are open, full of goop. Vaginal birth. You're squeezed out through the cave, the living cave. The goop is pushed out and your lungs are collapsed, closed. Then you emerge, and just by the sheer fact that you no longer have the constriction of the vaginal walls holding you in, your lungs now open back up. Now they're open again, but instead of being full of goop, they're filled with air. The next thing to exit the human lungs is not the goop from the womb, but the cry. When this goes well, it's not a simple exhale that comes out, it's a cry. And what I would suggest in the prefigurations of castration that we see in orality at the level of weaning, anality at the level of potty training, and again, I don't buy the whole stage thing. But if there is a stage of castration known as the phallic moment, I would suggest that the partial object that is prohibited by the no of the father in the logic of castration's early start is the cry. The partial object of the phallic drive as embodied in the name of the father as the no of the father is the cry. The same cry that was the first utterance that the newborn made is also the very thing that is X'd out by the name of the father. Think about it. A child's introduction into language basically translates in, use your big boy words. In other words, learn to speak like me, speak the other. This is why the subject finds its origin in the locus of the other, because as a linguistic entity, as an entity subject to signification, the subject is always beholden to a language that is not their own. That's not quite why we use the word alienation to describe castration, but it captures some essence of this. You have to learn to speak somebody else's language. And what you have to give up in that moment is your own language up to that point. The cry, the whimper. I can't understand you when you cry like that. Use your big boy words. Language displaces the cry. It marks a prohibition on the cry. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to cry. It just means that when you cry, it signals something different after the advent of language. Crying is different after you can speak than it is before. How this connects to the breast and the oral drive is interesting because we do have mouths here. Here's what I would suggest. The breast and the placenta are related ectopically. They both show the transition from fetus to newborn in a parasitic relationship to the mother. The placenta's loss allows the infant to breathe and cry. And the breast's loss allows the infant to demand. Also at the level of the cry. And that both of these, again, prefigure castration. And you can see this by the fact that the no of the father is fundamentally a prohibition against the cry. From birth to weaning, the cry is the dominant utterance, the expression of the subject of pure need that is interpreted as a demand by the big other, the primary caregiver. When the name of the father pops, first, of course, as the no of the father, as prohibition, it's a prohibition against continually crying when you experience a need. And it says, now, render your needs in terms of the mother tongue, my language, and that is a demand. The breast's loss allows the infant to start uttering demands. Let's pause there for a second. It's about 11:30. We're about an hour and a half in, and we're still working on position of the unconscious. Let's take 5 minutes for questions right now. I'm sure you've got some out there. I know this stuff gets weird. I'm talking 5 minutes, and no matter where we are in 5 minutes, we're going to end this essay. So let's start there. 5-minute opener for questions. What's up? What's on your mind?
Couldn't be the first cry something real, because like the voice as I don't know, as connected like the object little a.
Yeah, I mean, that could be, my question would be, who's real? For me, as the other in the room, when my kid cried for the first time, it was as real as it gets. For her, that ain't the real. So I think the question here would be, where are you relative to the symbolic? If you find yourself immersed in the symbolic, castrated, neurotic or otherwise, then the cry could certainly be the real. And in fact, you might even read it as just that, this moment where verbiage fails and all you can do is cry, moan, shriek in pain. The breath is very much the same way, and I'm doing it now too. I lived in Scandinavia for a bit. For some reason, the Danes got a hold of me. It was magnificent. In those days, I was very interested in Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard. And they do this thing over there where they don't even know they're doing it. You know what I'm talking about? That's the real at some level. What is it? This is tough because, right, if there's a Dane on the call, they're going to be like, what are you talking about? We breathe like normal people. Of course you do, but there's a strange gaspiness that Scandinavian languages afford. The breath, the cry, these moments that are like really nonverbal could absolutely be functioning as expressions of the real. Moment encounters with the real is the better way to put this. The real doesn't express anything. It is experienced as an encounter with a beyond that really can't be rendered in language. And as a result, oftentimes produces copious amounts of sweat. You might piss your pants a little bit. You might gasp or you might cry. But that's a real afforded by castration to somebody who is immersed in the symbolic. The child does not experience their cry as an encounter with the real.
But
Anybody want to follow up or?
How do you know? You said that that the real is just an effect of the symbolic, and I wondered what about what is with the childhood trauma or something real things which we would name as real. I don't know, why can't a little baby can't experience that?
Yeah, the first question, how do I know? I don't, for the same reason Lacan doesn't, nor anybody on this call, which is why he has to develop a myth. That's why we're dealing with a myth here. That's why I said that's the operative word. I don't want to, certainly don't want to suggest that children can't endure trauma. And certainly not this crowd. Are you kidding me? Many of the people, come on, think about it. It'd be a disaster. I mean, children can't experience trauma at the level of encounters with the real. No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm answering the specific question of the child's cry. And I don't believe that they would be experiencing that as an encounter with the real. If there's an encounter with the real that produces the cry, the encounter might be that of the stair step that hits the child as it goes tumbling down. That might count as an encounter with the real. But I do not think that that is how children, newborns, pre-linguistic beings experience the world. I don't think that a lizard sitting on a rock, when they get scooped up by a bird of prey, thinks, holy shit, I just got caught by a bird. Where did that come from? I don't think that's how that works. I think that in many ways, pre-linguistic, bioanalytic life is a state of pure horror, pure terror all the time. That's what I think it's like to be a lizard on a hot rock, purely fucking terrified. And I don't imagine it's too different to be a baby in front of a mirror. But let's leave that for now, because I don't want this myth to get the best of us. And we're now 1 minute past the 5-minute mark that I promised for questions. So hold on to them, throw them in the chat, follow up with comments in Substack or email me, and I'm happy to correspond more about this. We've got some fish to fry. Page 718 brings us to the beginning of the end of this essay on the position of the unconscious. And it's worth holding on to, the image of the egg, as we get to this point. What was life before division, before castration? It was an egg. Pure, undivided, indestructible, topologically eternal. Everyone, please mute your mics. The request is out. We're getting a little feedback, a little, which is great. That counts as the real. But let's go ahead and mute mics so we can enjoy the quiet. If you've got your mic on, mute it. Jim, that's you. Jim.
Sorry, I just said a computer. I'm not sure. It's not everybody on the computer trying to do it.
Jim, it sounds like you've got, looks like there are 2 Jims on this call.
Yeah, I just, because I have like a computer screen where I'm having trouble muting. Maybe I should try to leave that one. All right.
Okay, I'm going to remove one of you. Don't do it yet. Oh, you just did it, Jim. Never mind. Okay, you're cool. Jim, are you still there? Jim, can you hear us? Jim, Jim just cut his gimlet out, right? Omelet, gimlet, brilliant. I can't wait for someone to give a talk in here. And you know who you are. You know who you are. I can't wait to learn. I want to say something really quick about eggs, and I swear to God, you're never going to hear me speak about eggs again. You know what's weird about eggs? All spheres, for that matter. They are topologically eternal. You can say the same about a torus as well. They go on forever. Topologically speaking, they go on forever. They go around and around and around. They are undivided. The egg is a great image to have in mind as we're about to enter the beginning of the end of this essay. Page 718, let's start with the paragraph, except for its name. Who wants to read? Somebody we haven't heard from today who wants to share a bit of the load here. If you don't start reading, I'm going to tell you another thing about eggs. Some of you know I delivered some lectures on bubbles, and I still get people hollering at me wanting to know when I'm going to do bubbles round 2. I love bubbles, but eggs are just as interesting for some of the same reasons. You know that Lacan's theory of the egg, it's not just like bioanimalistic, mammiferous and the like. It's not just about mammals and the evolution of the egg. This is Humpty Dumpty, man. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. And that's why we have psychoanalysis. Okay, who wants to read?
Starting from where? Could you say the sentence again?
Thank you. Page 718, Standard English Translation. Second full paragraph begins, except for its name.
Except for its name, that I will now change to a more decent one, lamella, of which the word omelet is, in fact, but a metastasis. This image and this myth seem to me apt for both illustrating and situating what I call libido. The image shows libido to be what it is, namely an organ to which its habits make it far more akin than to a force field. Let us say that it is qua surface that it organizes this force field. This conception can be tested by realizing that Freud considered the drive to be structured like a montage, and by relating it to that.
Ah, finally, the drive. Thank you very much. So I think this is one of the weirdest moves. Libido is an organ. It is the organ of the drive. And yet it marks a body without them, a body without organs. The force field stuff is a kind of return to and try to move beyond Freudian understandings of libido. For us, though, we know why and how the drive is structured like a montage of openings, emergences, movements, and the like. It's attached to this organ of libido. We've got that from last time. This is a great little review. Who wants to read? And you can just continue, please. Referring to electromagnetic theory. Here we go.
Referring to electromagnetic theory, and in particular to a theorem known as Stokes' theorem, would allow me to situate the reason for the constancy of the drive's pressure, which Freud emphasizes so greatly, in the fact that the surface is based on a closed rim, which is the erogenous zone. Okay, all right, we're getting that montage. So the drive's pressure is constant. It's not a biological pressure, not because it's not rooted in the body. It's not biological because it does not work in a rhythmic quality, the way that fall leads to winter, leads to spring, leads to summer. That's not the pressure or the thrust of the drive. That's one element. And now we've got this closed rim of the erogenous zone. That's the second of 4 elements that go into this montage of the drive that we talked about last time. So far, we're cool. All review. With the exception of electromagnetic theory. Please continue with, it is also clear. It is also clear that what Freud calls the Schub or flow of the drive is not its discharge, but should rather be described as the turning inside out and outside in of an organ whose function should be situated in relation to the preceding subjective coordinates.
Okay. You know where I'm going to go with this. You've heard it from me before, but this is the drive theory that we're developing here. And we are developing it not by reading a secondary source on the drive. We are developing this by reading Lacan on the drive. There is a flow, which is not a discharge. You see, previous theorizations of the drive would suggest that there would be some sort of a bodily energetic buildup. And then that would hearken to the mind psyche, and the psyche would be like, okay, shit, we got to do something with that. Let's find something in the world that will allow for the discharge of that energy. Lacan's like, yeah, we're not messing with that. Electromagnetic theory, yes, but not this discharge of energy business. What Lacan is talking about is a drive that is active. The drive is an activity. Yes, it has active, reflexive, and passive tenses, but the drive is fundamentally something we do. It is an adventure. The drive is something that is more, not like an avatar. That's not right. The drive has a series of adventures and activities that it undertakes, but every single adventure that marks the drive has the same in-out structure. You see, erogenous zones marked by rim-like structures of so many mouths on the human body, as Lacan once put it. That's back from seminar 7, I believe. Are openings. Openings that can be open, openings that can be closed, the fence of the teeth, as Homer put it. When you have openings that can be opened and openings that can be closed, you allow yourself to have interiors and exteriors, insides and outsides. And the drive is something that emerges from an opening, like a bubble from a mouth, comes out, encompasses a void, not unlike a bubble from the mouth, and then comes back in to its original source. You know you're dealing with the drive when you've got an in-out operativity happening. And that's what we're seeing here. If you need the passage in Lacan, this is one of several, where he talks about the turning inside out and outside in of an organ. And not just any one, but one that should be articulate with all the subjective coordinates. This organ must be called unreal, in the sense in which the unreal is not the imaginary and precedes the subjective realm at conditions, being in direct contact with the real. And here's one way that we can answer that earlier question about the child's cry. It's not real, it's unreal. That is why my myth, like any myth, strives to provide a symbolic articulation rather than an image. And then here is the great bottom line from our session last time. My lamella represents here the part of a living being that is lost when that being is produced through the straits of sex. If lamella as libido is what is lost when the organism becomes a subject, a living subject through the straits of sex, the drive is what allows us to march that process back and reclaim and restore aspects, touches, tinges of the libido. This part is certainly indicated in the media, that microscopic anatomy materializes in the globules exposed for the two stages of phenomena organized around the chromosome reduction and anatomy. Sex gonad, okay, got it. He's talking about pigeons, right? We'll see. Represented here by a deadly being. It marks the relationship in which the subject plays a part between sexuality, specified in the individual, and his death. We also know what that means. Sexuality is always tinged with death, for one reason more than others, and that is because sexuality splits the living being into a reproductive function and a lethal function. In order for the species to live on via reproduction, the individual that propagates the species has to die. That's a very like bioanimalistic read on this. What's different about us is that we actually have words for this. You just heard some. We can actually talk about the relationship between sexuality and death. And in fact, what Lacan wants to point out constantly is everything you've heard him say about language, the signifier, and how it introduces us to death and loss and desire and the like. It's all fundamentally dealing with what we experience as sexed beings in relationship to the ultimate cut, which is death. We can use signifiers to talk about death in part, if not in whole, because the signifier is death. It's by way of the signifier for, remember last time, elephant, that I can bring forth something that is not here, that is absent, and might even very well be dead. Everybody with mics off, say the name of somebody who is dead. My mic is on, so I'll just say it, Jim. Not Jim, our friend here, and not Jimlet either, but an old buddy of mine named Jim. Dead. When you say that name out loud, it doesn't bring that motherfucker back to life, for better and for worse. It brings their death, their absence into your life, into your presence. The signifier is akin to death, which is how it connects us to sexuality. Regarding what is represented thereof in the subject, what is striking is the type of anatomical cut, breathing new life into the etymological meaning of the word anatomy. Don't just focus on anatomy, focus on the emphasis on breathing new life. This is Lacan on the page. This is not him live. He is very careful about the words he chooses, by which the function of certain objects, which should not be called partial, but which stands apart from others, is determined. The breast, to take an example of the problems to which these objects give rise, is not merely a source of regressive nostalgia, having been a source of highly prioritized nourishment. It is, I am told, related to the mother's body, to its warmth, and even to tender, loving care. But that does not sufficiently explain its erotic value, etc., etc. In fact, it is not a question of the breast in the sense of the mother's womb. Notice what's cracking here. Breast. The word he uses for breast in French can also mean womb. Bruce is pointing this out for a reason. Remember what we talked about, the placenta and the breast. The placenta and the breast. Even though people mix as they like resonances in which the signifier relies heavily on metaphor, it is a question of the breast specified in the function of weaning, which prefigures castration. Weaning has been too extensively situated since Klein's investigations in the fantasy of the partition of the mother's body for us not to suspect that the plane of separation, which makes the breast the lost object involved in desire, passes between the breast and the mother. For if we recall that mammalian organization places the young from the embryo right up to the newborn in a parasitical relation to the mother's body, the breast appears as the same kind of organ, to be understood as the ectopia of one individual onto another, as that constituted by the placenta at the beginning of the growth of a certain type of organism which remains specified by this intersection. This is what I was getting at. I don't stray from this text, nor am I making this shit up in any way. This is straight from Lacan, the ectopic relationship between the breast and the placenta. They're connected by the newborn, fetus to newborn's parasitical relationship to the mother figure. Here, it's an embodied, real mother, if you will. They are connected here. And I would like to suggest that what they are connected by is breath, lungs, and by extension, cries, the very thing that are prohibited by the no of the Father. Thou shalt not cry about it. All right. Ectopia, by the way, if you look it up, there's that top word, that topos word again, ek from the Greek meaning out. Ectopic relation is one in which an organ or a body part is displaced from one to the other. It's a really important word here. I'm focusing on it just to because I want you to understand that this ectopia of one individual to another is also modeled in the ectopic relationship between the placenta and the breast, the displacement of one organ or body part to another. And now, in conclusion, libido is this lamella that the organism's being takes to its true limit, which goes further than the body's limit. Profound statement right there. Scrolling down, this lamella is an organ, since it is the instrument of an organism. Okay, that's how Lacan says libido is an organ, because it is an instrument of the living subject, of the organism. Don't get caught up looking around in your swimsuit zone for your lamella. Speaking subjects, I'm at the bottom of 719, have the privilege of revealing the deadly meaning of this organ, and thereby its relation to sexuality, signification, sex, and death. Anytime that Holy Trinity pops up in the mid-60s for Lacan, prick your ears, because here we go. Speaking subjects have the privilege of revealing the deadly meaning of this organ, and thereby its relation to sexuality. This is because the signifier as such, whose first purpose is to bar the subject, has brought him the meaning of death. The letter kills, baby, but we learn this first from the letter itself. This is why every drive is virtually a death drive. Again, this is material we covered last time. Here it is again in Lacan. You can't make this stuff up. Final couple of sentences, and then we're going to take a second. It's important to grasp how the organism, bio-animalistic being, is taken up in the dialectic of the subject, the organ of what is incorporeal in the sexed being, incorporeal because unreal, is the aspect of the organism that the subject manages to invest when his separation occurs. It is through this organ that he can really make his death the object of the other's desire. And right now, we enter the field of the drive. In this way, the object he naturally loses, excrement, which is the so-called partial object of the anal drive, and the props he finds in the other's desire, the other's gaze, the other's voice. Here we have the partial objects of the scopic drive and of the invocatory drive come to this place. The activity in the subject I call drive. Notice the emphasis here again. Drive is an activity. The activity in the subject I call drive consists in dealing with these objects in such a way as to recover from them, to restore to himself his earliest loss. Here is a terrific definition of drive, and that's ostensibly what we're here to discuss this morning, or tonight, depending on where and what you are. Dealing with these objects, partial objects, in such a way as to recover from them and to restore to oneself this earliest loss, this loss of pure life, of that original egg, not the phantom that took flight. Perhaps it is indeed the egg that we're looking at here. The rest of 720 is lit. I'll let you read it. There's good stuff in here. A really key paragraph on the side of the living being. It's a nice little summative statement. On the side of the living being, here on page 720, as a being that will be taken up in speech, never able in the end to come to be altogether in speech, remaining shy, again, shy of the threshold, which notwithstanding is neither inside nor out. There is no access to the opposite sex as big other except via the so-called partial drives, wherein the subject seeks an object to take the place of the loss of life, libido, he has sustained due to the fact that he is sexed. Sexed, again, having to do with reproduction and death and a sundering of enjoyment. This was one of the passages that got me thinking that from here we might venture forth into seminars 19 and 20. Because here we're not just talking about sexuality, the straits of sexuality, bipolar, but relationship and access to the opposite sex, qua big other. Puts us right on the path. This is a great little prefigurative statement. And with that, let's pause. It's 11:52 a.m. in San Francisco. I want to take a 5-minute break. We just finished Position of the Unconscious. 5-minute break and then come back. The final hour, I want us to be focused on talking through the drive, mapping it if we need to, and putting these pieces together. So that by the end of our time together here, we're going to have an ability to talk through the drive in a way that even your dead friend can understand. Take 5. Come back in 5 minutes. I'll see you then. Has it been 5 minutes? Or am I just eager as hell? Math. Okay, I just want to check in with everybody here. I've started sharing my screen. And can somebody give me an indication just to make sure that this is visible to you?
Yeah, we can see.
Great, thank you. I want to also call your attention to the chat if you haven't already. The egg, yeah, we can talk about that more if you want, but I think it's great. And it really helps you figure out exactly the tradition that Deleuze and Guattari are working pretty damn hard to emerge from. I don't find their project tremendously convincing. I think it's a lot of work. I think it's smart as hell, but I don't find it very convincing. That said, I haven't seen the egg passage. Yo, the egg is there too. It's a failed myth. Love it. If you've got the passages in mind, Deleuzians out there, please throw it up in the chat so we can track it down for those of us who are extremely intrigued by eggs, which is perhaps only me. All right. Right now, it's time to get down to brass tacks and talk about the drive. So here's what we have. The progression from fetus to newborn to baby to child is full of prohibitions, constraints, pre and post figurations of castration. Most of the objects that are prohibited in the life of kiddos are tied to erogenous zones on the human body, which are in turn tied to something else, this prehistoric mythic libido. So the breast is the prohibited object of weaning that is tied to the mouth as the erogenous zone, which will also be the source of a drive, which is itself a portal into this mythic, unreal place of libido. When objects are prohibited or constrained, whether it's the breast in the weaning process, feces in the potty training process, the cry in the phallic stage, if you will, they become no things. And I want to emphasize this. We talked about it last time. It's very rare that in these sessions, we don't come around to talking about some no things. They are things made from the experience of prohibition. That's why I call them no things. The partial objects of the drive, breast, feces, gaze, voice, etc., they are all no things. Things that have been isolated, quarantined, placed under erasure, prohibited, node. The primary no that we often think about as Lacanians is the no of the Father, the first stage of the name of the Father that works via prohibition. But as we discussed last time, after the recording had stopped, unfortunately, there's a sense in which prohibition is really the basic underlying structure of society. Thou shalt not, the 10 Commandments, is as original as the social order gets. So these no things are part of a broader societal process, normativity, structured around a series of prohibitions. Well, guess what happens? The breast becomes a no thing in the process of weaning, and the mouth at some level becomes a no zone. Feces becomes a no thing in the stage of potty training. As a result, the anus is further moved into this category of no zones. Erogenous zones are usually no zones. in some way to varying degrees. So you have no things and no zones produced in this field of a rolling experience of prohibition. Object little a, this objet a, symbolizes the ensuing lack of object and attendant opening on the human body that emerges from this experience of no things and no zones. Object A is just the algebraic term, the little a that we use to mark the place where this shit used to be. The lost object gets the marking of little a to tell us that there is an experience of lack. Objet A symbolizes the experience of lack. In our case, for this example, for this discussion, it's the lack of an object: breast, feces, gaze, voice, cry, and so on and so forth. We can just keep filling in the blanks here of partial objects that are no things, that leave in the place where they used to be nothing, absence, lack. So when the breast becomes a no thing, the place where it has been placed under erasure and marked out is a place in which nothing appears. No things give way to nothings, and little a is what we use to mark those emerging openings, those emerging lacks or cuts. Objet A, little a, is not surprisingly the same algebraic term that we use to mark the origin of desire. Its cause. The cause of desire is the experience of lack. And we write that with a little a. Little a is the object cause of desire. It's the cause of desire. It's the experience of lack. What happens, as far as the drive is concerned, is that these lacks are really difficult to deal with. So desire is always in search of stuff. Here is the cause of desire. Here is the object of desire. Were you to simply desire breasts, and not just any breast, but the breast that was weaned from you back in the day, that wouldn't work out too well. Socially speaking, that'd be kind of challenging, which is why that image from last time of your mother walking into the conference room while you're in an awkward meeting, lifting up her shirt, pulling out her breast and saying, "Now suck, child, it's almost lunchtime," is so fucked up. Because, oh my gosh, no, that no thing is not what I'm after. Not after that at all. That's not allowed. That's against the rules. That's the 11th commandment, right? Thou shalt not covet thy mother's breast. That process, Lacan tells us in Seminar 7, is sublimation. When desire pursues not the breast that from which you were weaned, but instead the cigarette as an imaginary object. I like this as an imaginary object. And note, I'm also using the algebraic term for specular image here. I'm not fucking around. I'm doing this for a reason. This is a site of imaginary fixation. The objects of desire that drive us, oops, that was a slip, that draw us into the world of stuff, of things, of objects, are in points of imaginary fixation. The cigarette in place of the breast. Really in place of the lack of the breast. Which brings us to the drive. Drive reverses this process. Drive takes us from the field of objects that we hope, but also hope won't satisfy our desire, and fill in the blank left behind through this rolling series of prohibitions we've endured. Drive reverses this process, moving from objects to what this actually is, which is an opening. This is why I say at the start of today's work that the cause of desire is the object of the drive. The cause of desire, the experience of lack, is where the drive heads. It moves away from the sublimated objects that desire vaunts, purchases, consumes, back toward the experience of lack that conditioned the pursuit desirously of those objects. That's also why I say that drive is not a sublimative experience. It's desublimation at work. Drive is desublimation. And this is why it's so weird in Seminar 7 that we have that talk again of ordinary objects rising to the level elevated to the dignity of das Ding, of the thing. What a horrible way to treat your thing, to allow ordinary objects to rise to that level. Hell no, man. The sublimatory process of finding ordinary objects to substitute for the das Ding, the thing that has been axed from your life, is a humiliating endeavor. What the drive shows us is that the stuff, all the imaginary fixations that are the object of desire, are actually rooted in das Ding. It's not that they are elevated to the level of das Ding. It's that when you push on those objects, they're rooted in das Ding. That's the difference. Lacan needed one more sentence after that one to tell us this part. Ordinary objects that are elevated to the status of das Ding, of the thing, Seminar 7 here, the truth of that, when the drive enters, is that those ordinary objects are not rising to the level of das Ding. They are rooted in the soil of loss, of lack, of das Ding, of the thing beyond all things. That's an important part here. Were we to keep going, what we would find is that this A, that is the cause of desire, is connected to a whole host of lost objects. You can just write some of them in. Breast, feces, the cry, the gaze, and of course, the famous etc. that many folks like to talk about in terms of Zizek's and so on. We don't need to mess with that. You see where it's headed, which is nowhere. What we're looking at here are partial objects that have been prohibited. These are the no things that we were talking about. These are also, though, connected to openings, erogenous zones, what I called no zones, more or less no zones, you might say. So the breast has the mouth, feces has the anus, the cry has the, I'll let you figure that one out, the gaze has the eye, and so on and so forth. We can just keep going with this, right? Each of these erogenous zones are openings. Little a is an opening. Each of these is an opening. And there's more. These no zones are not just openings. They are archaic representations, leftovers portals to that earlier loss. They are what Lacan calls libidinal residues. The mouth, the anus, all of the limited openings on the human body, they are libidinal residues. So what you have here is that between libido and the drive, there's the human body. Each of these nozones that allow for the drive by way of the human form to access libido, mythic or otherwise, are rim-like, edge-like structures, most of which can open and close, and therefore allow for interiors and exteriors. The erogenous zones are really an important part of the drive. They are the openings from which the drive emerges, runs its circuit around objet A, and then returns back to that very same point. And here's what else I want to say. All of these erogenous zones are irreducible by sublimation. Sublimation can never fully reduce and close the openings afforded by these nozones. No cigarette can fully plug your mouth. It doesn't work that way. There is an irreducible libidinal economy at the level of erogenous zones, according to Lacan, that cannot ever be fully sublimated. There's always something left. It could just be at the level of intense nerve relations around these rim-like structures. I would suggest, though, that these are in fact real points of access to the libido. Whatever we're doing with this mythic thing, lamella libido, each of these orifices is a portal to it. These are all portals from one dimension, if you will, to the next. That's why the metaphor of the cave and the birth canal that we spent so much time working on in Position of the Unconscious is so important here. The drive is a tunneling activity that emerges, pops up, and then goes right back down into the tunnels. It's constantly passing through openings that are sometimes closed, but oftentimes also open. I don't know how much time we want to spend on this, what else we want to note here, but I'll add this. Everything you see in yellow from little a back to libido, I would say occupies the heart of the libidinal economy. This little a might even be it. It's what opens us into the field of libido. And I would just add something else. The sublimatory process that we're talking about here and associating with desire is hella normative. Now, this is going to come as this will not be a surprise to anybody who's thought about sublimation. Of course, sublimatory processes are normative, but they are also propped up by a whole host of fantasies. Fantasy is operative at the point of sublimation, which is why I say that the objects glommed onto by the sublimatory process are points of imaginary fixation. That shit is real. At the level of the drive, what we see is a different matheme altogether, and you know it all too well at this point. Fantasy gives way to drive with the reverse course of desublimation when drive is operational. Also worth noting, as I think somebody just popped up in the chat here, is that the imaginary sublimatory process of desire is governed by the pleasure principle. It's worth noting. But what's at stake? And the desublimatory process of the drive is well beyond that, and not in a transgressive way. not pleasure, but enjoyment. If the pleasure principle governs the desirous, imaginative, sublimatory pursuit of objects instead of openings, enjoyment guides, leads, goads the drive from imaginary points of fixation, cigarettes and otherwise, back to the openings these objects were designed to plug. And from there, at the heart of the libidinal economy known as objet, all of this other movement back into the lost object, the no thing, from there to the no zone, the erogenous zones, the sources of the drive, and ultimately accessing, even if only a little bit, this notion of libido. How does all of this fit in Lacan's broader project? I think we could pretty easily render it this way. There's a spectrum of being and having. The further right you go, the closer you cleave to the field of meaning, of having. Cigarettes are things you can have. The further left you go in the direction of libido, the closer you get not to meaning, but to being. And that's the important thing here to remember. Drive has access to both in a way that desire does not. Drive allows libido and language to flux in and out of each other. Drive has access to the field of meaning and signification. It knows about objects. It knows about imaginary points of fixation, but it also knows about openings. And by God, if it doesn't pursue, if only via ignorance, libido and something beneath, beyond, through those openings. The drive is so important in this sense because it is a portal, not just between libido and desire. The drive is a portal between the field of meaning, the field of the big other, and the field of being, the field of the organism. And you now can see what we're talking about here. In the circles that overlap in Seminar 11 of meaning and being with non-meaning in between. What else is that between but the opening that ultimately symbolizes the drive? The lozenge left after the subject and demand have faded. What's left is an opening. And it's an opening where you can access meaning, but also being. The drive is important. This is one of the reasons why it's important. Let's pause there for some additional questions. What's on your mind?
I guess I could ask a couple of questions.
How about one?
So one is just a clarification of like a piece of language that I think is slightly confusing, which is that the drive circles around objet R, right? Yes. That's just difficult to grasp. what that actually means for it to circulate around a lac, let's say.
Yeah, isn't that fucking wild? And it's 100% true according to Lacan. So here is your bubble logic of the drive at work. Here you've got your source. Here you've got your aim. Down here, I guess, is where you could put thrust.
Mhm.
The source is the erogenous zone. This is also the no zone we've been talking about. And then we come to the object of the drive, which according to Freud can be kind of whatever you want it to be, whatever you glom onto, and then you retroactively through experience, take that object as the object of whatever drive it satisfied, according to Freud. What Lacan wants to notice is he wants to take this idea that the object of the drive is so indifferent to the drive because it's not actually an object at all. It is instead an opening. And that's why Lacan chooses for the object of the drive, little a. It's an opening of sorts. And in fact, if you want to think about this in terms of another good diagram that Lacan messes with in seminar 11, I think I did a post on this in our Substack on hoop nets. So the hoop net is like, it's a kind of like vascular looking thing. It goes like this. And the idea is that fish swim through a very small hole and then they enter this big portal in beneath, and they get kind of looped around in there and they can't quite find the little hole to get out. So a hoop net looks kind of like this. Lacan's point is that this is little a right here. And you might say this is the unconscious down here or whatever, but the point is that it's a small, narrow portal through which things can pass. And I think if you want to be kind of clever about what's happening here, take the circle around objet A in the drive and remember that it's the opening here in the neck of a hoop net as well. So you have to imagine if you're looking at the drive as you are right now, when you look at A, what you're looking at is a hole. And you look through that hole, through that opening, but into that opening, you find the unconscious. It's an opening into something else. It's not just a vacuum. It's not just a void. It's an opening, a portal into something else. And so what I would say is imagine as you look at the little a in the diagram of the drive, as though you are looking down the neck of a hoop net. You're looking down the neck through this and into this other area where something else resides. And what I would like to suggest is that as you look through that thing, what you see are prohibited objects, more primitive than the socially acceptable ones that your desire pursues, breast, feces, and the like. But what I would suggest is that what you really see are not the objects that were there. You don't see the breast that used to be there. What you see is, in fact, its absence, its void, its prohibition, its barred status. That in turn is also a portal. So you pass through, you come out of the erogenous zone, you circle around an opening, maybe catching a glimpse into it in order to hopefully see a breast. But what you see is not a breast, but instead a continuation of the tunnel. Pursuing that continuation is the task of the drive. That's why you never just go around once. You take a few laps. The aim of the drive is circuitous. It doesn't just come out and like take a peek and then dip back. It comes out and it goes around and around and around. And then it goes back, only to then come back out again and do the same thing. Nobody masturbated once and figured they had done it. and they were good for now, forever. No, the drive is recursive in its aim, but also in its relationship to the object. It passes around the rim, the edge of the void, if you read Badiou, and peering into it sees not the partial object that was prohibited, but a furtherance of the opening. And Lacan's myth is to kind of try and tell us what's at the bottom, what's ultimately at the bottom. What I would suggest is that if you want to layer this thing out, you've got little a. Well, I guess what you would say is this. You've got all these partial objects. Once you pull those out, because that's also what goes in here and plugs the hole, once you pull those out, you see A, which is an opening. Once you look through that, what you see are not partial objects that were removed to create that opening, but instead the fact that they are barred, removed. You see, in other words, another opening, another lack, another gap. Looking past that, then what you would see is what Lacan calls libido. And the drive is what moves through all of these openings. That's why it is fundamentally symbolized algebraically by the lozenge. It is a passage through openings. And I don't think that libido is down here in the bottom of the basket waiting. In fact, what I would suggest is if we really want to be clever about this, what's at the bottom of the basket is the unconscious. Libido is something else. But the unconscious also moves the same way. That's why position of the unconscious is really important here. And that's why I emphasize the cave and the openings and all this stuff. The rim-like in, out, open, closed, temporal pulsations that show us the unconscious. You see the hoop net here, this opening is also one that can be closed. What is the first thing you grab as a fisherman when you reach down to pull up your hoop net? This is where you grab. This is where you constrict. You tighten that thing up and you pull up your net with all the fish inside. So it's an opening that can close. Among other things that get plugged up in that hole, it's not just the stuff of desire. Transference is also a closing of that hole. Nevertheless tells you where it is. So underneath there is also the unconscious. What else is this but, in fact, the cave door? The temptation in psychoanalysis, and here I'm cribbing from Bruce's work, is to think that you want to focus on what the analysand tells you is all the stuff they want, all the things they're into. Oh, I'm not, that's not, I saw something really scary in a movie last night, and it was like a horrible relationship they were having, but that's not the kind of relationship I want to have. And the trap would be the analyst who then says, well, what kind of relationship do you want to have? Enough about your desire. Let's talk a little bit more about your desire. And Bruce's point is, no, man, that's a trap and an invitation to focus on their imaginary objects, their fixations. Instead, Bruce says, focus on the disgust and the horror that got them aroused enough to tell you the story in the first place from that part in the movie. It's a different orientation. And his wager, which I think is right conceptually, I'm not that kind of doctor, but conceptually it lines up with what Lacan is doing, is to say that if you focus not on the object of desire that the analysand says they want, in other words, not the plugging of the hole, but the hole that felt the need to be plugged at the level of the subject, what you then have instead is an access to what they enjoy. It's no longer about desire, but jouissance. And that is the opportunity structure for the drive. For the subject of the drive to displace or sideline for a minute or just put a fucking muzzle on the subject of desire so that something else can be experienced. And I understand this to be a solid analytic move. I've talked to other Lacanians who say this shit works. I don't know. But I think the idea is that wherever you see a blockage, kind of makes sense. You'd be looking for the hole that that blockage filled or attempted to fill. And what else is the lamella? Look up lamella. Think about it in terms of mushrooms, fibers, and little flat things that fit in little places. Lamella is a weird, weird thing. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it did.
Okay.
It really does. I guess I'd still like to know how you would use the word satisfaction in relation to this structure. Like,
Yeah.
what does drive satisfaction mean in the context of everything you've just said? That will be one like follow-up.
Yeah, I think that's great. Look, I said this last time, and I think I want to just really emphasize this because that question is so spot on. It is what's at stake in all of this. If indeed the drive signals the end of analysis, if it's the beyond of analysis, and satisfaction is what is afforded by the drive, what the hell is that? Let's be clear. The goal of psychoanalysis is to separate from the other, without all the inhibitions and influences of normative society and sexuality, while still remaining like attuned to death, this biological finality of sex, and also the form and function of speech. But separating from the other, the big other, from society, that's an important part of psychoanalysis, and it's an important part of what the drive affords. This tradition, again, is not one that I'm coming up with out of the blue. I think you can trace this from Lacan to Miller to Fink. But desire alone can't get this done. Desire isn't enough because first, desire is always pegged and subservient to the law. What the law prohibits, desire seeks. The type of enjoyment, impinging on satisfaction here, that is accessible at the level of desire is always and only at the level of transgression of the law. You can only experience enjoyment vis-a-vis the field of desire by breaking the rules. It's always, in other words, maladaptive. Enjoyment, whether you willfully or accidentally discover it in the field of desire, typically by way of symptom, is maladaptive and ultimately unsatisfying. Desire is a dead end because the type of enjoyment that desire conditions is transgressive. And what we know is that transgressive enjoyment is beholden to the law. The law has to be there in order for me to break it and experience enjoyment. That's a maladaptive conception of jouissance. And desire is a dead end as a result. What matters here, to your question, is that it's unsatisfying. Fucking on an airplane is in the end pretty unsatisfying. It might be intense for a minute because you're breaking the rules, but it's not satisfying. So you can think of examples like, they want me to do it, so I won't. Dad wants me to become an engineer, so I'm not going to do it. Whether you are revolting against the gender identity that was assigned to you at birth or embracing it wholeheartedly, your identity is still pegged, if you will, on that assignment. I'm not supposed to eat snacks after 10 p.m., so I will. I'm living it. You know what? I saw it on a commercial. It said, I earned this. I've been working hard all week. You know what? I've earned another beer. I deserve this. That's exactly what you deserve. What's silenced and suppressed in all of this is, of course, the drive and the type of satisfaction that the drive affords. Now, we don't quite know what that is yet, but I think we're close. To such an extent that here's what I would say. Desire guards against the drive. It's a defense against the drive. Fantasy helps, but desire is the real muscle, although propped up oftentimes by fantasy, that guards against the drive, keeping us on these sublimatory cycles. Part of the task of psychoanalysis is to liberate the drive and shift from other people's demands as we imagine them, other people's desires as society throws them to us, to all those no things that can bring real satisfaction. Note the move here, from imaginary demands to symbolized desires to real satisfaction. So the first thing is that the satisfaction afforded by the drive is going to be a real satisfaction. The subject of the drive is a subject of the real. In order for this to happen, though, it's not like you get to re-suck your mom's breasts. That's not what we're talking about here. Objet A has to be embraced, not as what I imagine you to want me to do. There's fantasy, the matheme for fantasy. There's a little A in an imaginary object position. And it certainly can't be what I think you want. There's the symbolic. There's objet A at the level of desire. But instead, it has to be experienced as my lack. The drive does not get us back to mommy's tit. What it does is it gets us to the lack that is left in its place and embracing it as our lack. I think that's a really important part of this. There's an ownership that happens at the field of lack that desire doesn't have. Desire never wants to own up to its lack. It'll tell you all day long what it wants, but it can't ever tell you why. It pursues recognition from others, but it can never recognize its own cause. It never wants to talk about why I actually want the cigarette. Not what I want. I know that answer. I want the cigarette, but why do I want it? That's the very thing that drive goes for. I want it because I don't have it, because I lack it. That experience of lack is the object of the drive. And so in order for the real satisfaction that Lacan promises at the level of the drive to be experienced, that kind of jouissance that is not transgressive and dissatisfying, but instead adaptive, well-adjusted, satisfying to happen, the first thing to occur is a shift from objects to openings. I'm no longer interested in certain entities as I am in the lack that put me on their trail in the first place. And that lack is mine. This is why fundamentally, psychoanalysis does not have an ontology. There is no ontology of Lacanian psychoanalysis because the ontology of psychoanalysis is a meontology. It doesn't deal with being, ontos in the Greek. It deals with non-being, lack, absence, emptiness. That's the hook. The hook of psychoanalysis at root philosophically is that its ontology is in fact a meontology. It deals not with being, but with non-being. And objet A is so central to the drive because it is a symbol of non-being at the heart of my libidinal economy, not yours, mine. The drive makes it about me. The subject of the drive finally gets to enjoy what they enjoy. You see, the subject of desire, to the extent that they experience enjoyment, all they're really getting off on is what you've told them they can't have. And so their enjoyment is still hooked into your demands and desires. The drive is a way out of that. That's why it's the fourth fundamental concept of psychoanalysis. It doesn't appeal to the big other. It doesn't ask permission. The whole goal here, in other words, for drive satisfaction, when that occurs, it's like desire's still there, but we're not inhibited by it. It doesn't tell us what to do anymore. There's just no opportunity for that. And what desire stops doing is it stops inhibiting our satisfaction, which brings us to the answer to the question, I think. What exactly is it to experience drive satisfaction? What is the satisfaction? Here's how I would put it. And I think I'm quoting Bruce here on this one. It allows you to enjoy your enjoyment. You can enjoy jouissance at the level of a drive that you cannot at the level of a drive or at the level of desire. Desire will give you enjoyment, but it will never let you enjoy it. You can get drunk as hell on desire. You can drink as many beers as you want. You can get out there. You can break all those rules. The drive, though, is that sip of beer that forces you to pull the cup away from your mouth, make eye contact with the glass, and say to it, God damn, that's good. It allows you to enjoy your enjoyment, to have a jouissance relative to the thing that you're getting after. And it's a cup, a vascular being just like you. God damn, that's good. I think the satisfaction of the drive is the satisfaction of having a non-transgressive experience of enjoyment. Jouissance without the law as its fundamental peg. This doesn't mean, again, this does not mean that you live in a world without constraint. The drive is not like some fucking hedonistic approach to life. It's not this overwhelming, unbridled desire. That's important too, but it's not what we're getting at here at this point. The superego is still there. The big other is still there. It's just that jouissance in the field of the drive becomes something permitted. And I think that's really key here. In this tradition from Lacan to Miller to Fink, the difference between desire and the drive is their relationship to jouissance. Desire's relationship to enjoyment is transgressive. I can enjoy only by breaking the rules of society. The drive's relationship to enjoyment is permissive. Enjoyment at the level of the drive is not prohibited, it is permitted. You allow yourself in a way that at the level of desire, we never do. So I mentioned earlier, like how you might try and do this in clinical practice. A lot of this is, I take it straight from the folks who I trust around clinical work, first and foremost being Bruce Fink. I think he's pretty good on this point. You focus less on what the analysand says they want and more on moments of affective intensity, expressions of satisfaction in their speech that they are very quick to censor. You see, there's that moment in the film that gave you a strange feelings, great sadness that grossed you out. And then you say, but that's not the kind of relationship I want to have. That would never happen in the relationship that I want to achieve. Very quickly, desire rushes in that moment of enjoyment to talk about what it wants. A really maladaptive relationship that Jeffrey Dahmer had to his third ostensive boyfriend. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine that being my partner because I would never want that. I don't like to eat frozen human flesh. I like mine fresh. I can't imagine being in that relationship with Dahmer, et cetera, et cetera. The point here, though, is that analytically speaking, what you would do is punctuate those moments of desirous expression and instead emphasize or highlight the previous moment of excitement that desire then censored. Get back to that previous moment, that turn on, that moment of disgust without seeming disapproving. This is how I read the clinical experience working out here. Strange feelings, great sadness, you name it. You give them a place in the subject. Experiences of jouissance that are not rushed away from, but instead have a special place that's just for them. Here's why I think it's really important. And this is what's going to carry us beyond the tradition that I'm just describing here. One of the things I hear Bruce Fink saying about this moment is that you wouldn't let these intense expressions of affect, these affective intensities, to be explained away. You don't allow desire to rush in and immediately move in the opposite direction. You don't take the bait as an analyst. And Bruce says something really smart here, I think. He says, you don't allow these expressions of affective intensity in analysis to be explained away as anxiety. And I think that's important here. Desire may be a defense against anxiety, as we learn in Seminar 10. But both desire and anxiety guard against the kind of satisfaction that the drive affords. They guard against any experience of jouissance that is not at the level of transgression. They inhibit jouissance in the sense of drive satisfaction, in the sense of a permissible experience of jouissance. The analysand, according to Fink and in this tradition, is rushing away from jouissance as though it's off limits, illegal, barred, when in fact they should be having a special place, which is, I would say, therapy, to work on those things, to think about those things, to embrace those things at some level, because that is them. But this important move towards anxiety, I think, is where things get interesting. Part of the challenge of getting to an experience of enjoyment that is non-transgressive is that you don't just have to battle against desire, you also have to battle against anxiety. Anxiety is always there at the hedges of jouissance, guarding against it. This is exactly why we get this definition of the drive in Lacan's essay on the drive. It's a 3-page masterpiece. The drive, he says, is a misadventure of desire at the hedges of jouissance, watched out for by an evil God. What I'm here suggesting is that the evil God that helps desire guard against permissible experiences of jouissance is anxiety. Anxiety is the evil God that watches out for the drive. And as a result, makes it that much more difficult to experience non-transgressive enjoyment. Anxiety is always there, lurking, waiting for desire as it approaches this limit, this hedge of the desiring subject, beyond which, well, we'll see what's beyond which. Let's be very clear about this. Where exactly is the hedge, are the hedges that Lacan is referring to? Where is the hedge of jouissance? I'm going to show you. You know the graph of desire. There's desire. There's fantasy. And we've talked about how there are 2 turns afforded once fantasy starts to bottom out. And my understanding is that most folks go to analysis because their fantasy stops holding water. It stops doing the trick for them. And it's not like they want change. It's instead like they want to cling to their fantasy. I learned that on Instagram. Thank you, Dr. Childs. Instagram's great for this shit. You gotta get in on this stuff, man. There's all kinds of brilliant business happening on Instagram, figuring out this stuff, throwing out that quote that gives you something to think about all day. Yeah. At fantasy, when it starts to bottom out, you can turn left and you can go back down and run this regressive circuit of demand that we talked about last time. Or you can take the right turn. Up at the top here is a signifier of the lack in the other. What I would suggest here is that this is the hedge of jouissance. That Lacan is talking about. The hedges of jouissance are right here. And they guard against any turn towards what would be a source of anxiety. And I read this element here, a signifier of the lack in the other, as a signifier of anxiety. If you read Seminar 10, check out our lectures on this. It's when the big other appears to us as a desirous, because lacking or barred just like us, other, that we start to feel anxious. Because suddenly our lack becomes the object of their desire. Childhood anxiety oftentimes starts, my understanding, in this moment. When the overwhelming desire of a primary caregiver threatens to swallow up the capacity for desire at the level of the infant, at the level of the child. Anxiety is my experience of a lack because you took it from me, because you were too desirous, so to speak. And the reason why this is important for the graph of desire is that what else out here do you see, but in fact, jouissance. Jouissance is out here on the graph of desire, right next to the signifier of the lack in the other that would cause us anxiety. So anxiety belongs out here. And this is the hedge that keeps us from making this move. Now, I think this is very important because it suggests that the pathway to the drive is a tricky one if you're moving in this direction. Look at all the work you got to do. Fantasy breaks down, you got to fucking deal with desire, and then you got to also deal with anxiety, and then you pass through there only to finally get to drive. That's pretty fierce as a way to proceed. What if, though, there was another way you could go? What if there was another way that you could get to the drive without having to go through anxiety? And this is where I want to end today, by suggesting that there very well might be. And the key figure here is Alcibiades. I'm going to make this look a little bit more like the graph of desire. When you look at the upper portion of the graph of desire, there are actually two pathways to the drive. One is the one we just described, where you pass through the hedge of jouissance, defeating desire and anxiety enough to at least put a muzzle on them for you to experience the drive. But there's something more. I want to conclude by suggesting that there are two gateways to the drive. The first is by way of anxiety, which Lacan suggests in his drive essay. Passing through this evil god of anxiety. The second gateway to the drive is not by way of an evil god, but instead by way of a drunk man named Alcibiades. If you've got ears to hear, we are back with the theme that is always popping up in these early to mid 1960s works of Lacan, especially when he talks about love, libido, his myth, Alcibiades. Not just Aristophanes who shows up. He's also in the Symposium, by the way. It's Alcibiades that is a key figure here. Look for Alcibiades in the Subversion of the Subject essay, and you'll see some pretty wild stuff. Page 699, English translation. You don't have to check it out. Let me just quote it. Alcibiades is by no means neurotic. In fact, it is because he is the epitome of desirousness, a man who pursues jouissance as far as possible, that he can thus, though with the help of an instrumental drunkenness, produce before everyone's eyes the central articulation of the transference, when in the presence of the object adorned with its sparkle. If you're looking for how Deleuze and Guattari might fit into this, it's between the D of desire and the matheme of the drive, occupied here by the green Alcibiades. This is somebody who epitomizes desirousness, whose desire is unchecked, who pursues jouissance as far as possible, regardless of anxiety. Let's consider this for a second. In fantasy, the neurotic fades before the brilliance of their little a. Subject of the drive here being eclipsed by fantasy of the ego in particular. But fantasy and the ego, they don't change the fact that we're castrated, subjected to the other and the like. So the question then is, how do you get past all this shit? How do you get past the imaginary fixations of the fundamental fantasy? Alcibiades is one of two ways. You can go anxiety or you can go Alcibiades. Alcibiades flaunts his desirousness, his subjective division, his castration. it allows him to pursue jouissance as far as possible. That's what we're learning from the subversion of the subject essay. In other words, Alcibiades' experience of desire is not a defense against jouissance, but instead a gateway to it. His desire is so unhinged that even jouissance is accessible. Think about that. Notice what happens in the Symposium. Alcibiades shows up drunk as hell. He's got to have people prop him up just to get him in the door. And he introduces a fundamentally new order. You see, prior to his arrival, everybody was talking about and giving talks about the conceptual ideal of love. Oh, what does love mean? All these speeches about love and the abstract. Alcibiades shows up and he's like, hey, y'all, here's a better idea. Let's talk about why we love the people seated to our right. From the conceptual ideal of love to actual people in the room. That's the shift that Alcibiades lets in. It's no longer about the abstract notion of beauty. What an ultimate sublimation. But about a desublimated relationship to the actual body sitting next to you. Read the Symposium and then read Seminar 8. It's all right there. Even, however, at this level, these eulogies are stand-ins for the practical experience of love itself. Even though, in other words, Alcibiades says, let's talk about why we love the people next to us, you're still talking. You're not at the drive yet. Drive is about the practical, lived, embodied experience of loving another, not talking to them about it. It's like Kierkegaard said, to speak of love and to speak of faith is to admit that you are not the lover and certainly not among the faithful. The point here is that Alcibiades goes beyond all social norms and propriety when he speaks of love. But here's the thing, man. Alcibiades is still uneasy about this. He's not entirely cool with just being unhinged. So that's an important element of this, maybe even a sticking point in this placement of Alcibiades as a second pathway to the drive. One thing is for sure, though, and I think this is the crucial point, Alcibiades is not afraid of castration. He is impassioned by ignorance. He doesn't actually know what he wants. But isn't this the basic question? In Seminar 8, Lacan says that the lover doesn't know what they lack, and the loved or beloved doesn't know what they have. The trick that Socrates via Plato plays here is to help Alcibiades understand his lack, not what he wants in Socrates. You got to read the Symposium, I guess, to get all this, but instead why he wants that, what exactly he's after. And I think this is one of the reasons why Lacan often identifies Socrates as an initial analyst, a proto-analyst, because he does a really good job of turning the ignorance regarding their own lack of the lover back onto itself, helping the lover then become intrigued by what it is they're missing. In the case of Alcibiades, it's this weird love triangle that he wants with Socrates and Agathon. Again, check out Seminar 8, check out Symposium. I'm moving fast and loose here for a reason. It's no coincidence that the theme of the Symposium is love. It's also a theme that keeps coming up in the readings that we've done to understand something about the drive. And I do want to end with this elusive reference to love again. Seminar 11, it doesn't just end with the drive, it ends with this notion of limitless love. If we accept that part of the job of analysis en route to the drive is to cause the analysand to become curious about their own desire, their own little a, their own lack. I can't help but wonder how this hooks into the Lacanian theory of love that would suggest a sharing of lack with another person. Doesn't mean I give you mine. It means I allow you to have yours. If love is giving what I don't have, maybe analysis is a teaching in how to love. By preparing me, familiarizing me with my own lack, I'm better able to accept yours and to thus afford you lack, to give you what I myself don't have, to give you the experience of lacking and allow you to have it just like me. How this might result in what Lacan at the end of seminar 11 calls limitless love, I don't know the answer to that question, but I would suggest that it has something to do with the non-transgressive theory of drive satisfaction, of enjoyment, of jouissance, that we get at the level of the drive. It doesn't mean we're not constrained. It doesn't mean society has become inoperative. It means that we don't feel inhibited by it. I don't know if that means that in translating it into love, the experience would be limitless, but I think there's something there.